Lester Hunt became, I think, in the late 40s and the early 50s, one of the most significant politicians in the country whose name is not remembered. Part of the problem is that the nature of his death overshadowed the accomplishments of his life. Because in 1954 there was enormous stigma both about homosexuality and about suicide. And Lester Hunt's widow made it her life's work to make sure that the story of his suicide was never told. She went so far as to threaten the author of the premier Wyoming history textbook that if he put anything about the suicide in his textbook that she would sue him. And so although he knew part of the story about the blackmail, he left it out. And so for all these years, students of Wyoming history have read a book that on page 521, and who gets that far in a semester, but on page 521 of Dr. Larson's book, it says, overcome by personal and political problems, Lester Hunt took his own life on June 19th, 1953. As a politician, Lester Hunt was enormously well liked. This always has been a state where Democrats have a hard time getting elected. But the first time he ran for office, he was the top vote getter in his county, got elected to the legislature. People around the state then asked him to run for state office, and he became Secretary of State, and then governor. He was somebody who took public service seriously, believed that if there was a problem to be solved, he needed to lead the way to get it done. And as a result, he became, as a Democrat, the most popular politician in the state. He had been governor for 6 years. He had just been reelected to a second four-year term and started thinking about running for the Senate, and then was elected to the U.S. Senate midway through his second term as governor. McCarthy was elected to the U.S. Senate 2 years ahead of Lester Hunt. The relationship between Hunt and McCarthy was bad from the very beginning. 3 months after Hunt was sworn into the Senate, he was appointed to a select committee to investigate Nazi war crimes at the Battle of the Bulge. At the end of World War II, Nazis had massacred dozens of American soldiers after the Battle of the Bulge, and after the war were tried as war criminals. The Soviet Union and others around the world began making charges that the American military officers in charge of the prosecution had used torture and a variety of other techniques to exact confessions from the Nazis, and it was a public relations problem for the United States in the early years of the Cold War. So the Senate decided they should investigate, and Hunt was one of 3 members appointed to the committee to conduct that investigation. McCarthy was not on the committee, but he insinuated himself into the committee proceedings, and at the 27 plus hearings they held in Washington and around the country, McCarthy sat in on the panel. And when you read the transcripts of those hearings, it's the McCarthy we know from history, constantly interrupting, constantly berating witnesses and other members of the committee, and ironically taking the position favorable to the Nazis. Eventually, he stormed out of the committee, wrote his own report, accused Hunt and the other 2 of whitewashing the investigation. And so that was Lester Hunt's introduction, not just to Washington, but to Joe McCarthy. And Hunt would soon become the first major politician in this country to challenge McCarthy publicly, and he called him a liar and a drunk. Hunt and his wife lived in a house that overlooked some apartment buildings below, and he could see the patio behind Joe McCarthy's apartment, and he often talked about how he was forced to sit and watch McCarthy drink and cavort with women, and Joe McCarthy was just not Lester Hunt's type of guy. Hunt introduced legislation to allow citizens to sue members of Congress for slander, specifically targeted at McCarthy for the ways in which he had ruined so many lives. So the 2 of them were very antagonistic. At one point, an elevator operator in the Senate office building reported to Senator Hunt that he had overheard a conversation, McCarthy to another person, where McCarthy said, "I'm going to get that SOB if it's the last thing I do." And so they they were at each other from the beginning. That relationship was very antagonistic. In June of 1953, Lester Hunt's son, a young adult, was arrested in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House by an undercover agent for soliciting homosexual sex. The background to that incident is really a fascinating piece of history, because when you look at the LGBT community before McCarthy, certainly there was discrimination, but homosexuals were not targeted. They seldom lost their job because of their sexual orientation. They had a vibrant social community in the large cities, including Washington, where there were parks and restaurants and bars and other places where they gathered without being hassled by policemen or others. McCarthy comes along, and of course he makes his Wheeling, West Virginia speech with the allegation that there were all of these communists in the State Department. When he couldn't prove that, Senator Styles Bridges, who was one of the conspirators in the blackmail against Lester Hunt, very powerful. He was the Senate pro tem, in those days third in line to become president of the United States. He goes to McCarthy and says, look, you're having a hard time proving that there are communists in the State Department, but there are homosexuals. And we all know that homosexuals are security risks. So during one of the Senate hearings on McCarthy's allegations, the State Department testified, and they were asked. One of the senators said, we're aware that you recently fired 91 people from State Department jobs. Is that because they were communists? He said, no, they weren't communists, but they were homosexuals. And there was an executive order back to Truman and through Eisenhower that required the discharge of homosexuals. And McCarthy and others began to conflate the issue of national security with sexual orientation, saying that homosexuals were security risks. Went so far as to make the outrageous claim that Adolf Hitler had assembled a lengthy list of American homosexuals with the goal of compromising their loyalty and turning them into spies for the Nazis. And that at the end of World War II, that list had fallen into Stalin's hands, and now Stalin was busy using that list to recruit spies for the Soviet Union. And so in all of the growing fervor about the Cold War, this allegation overnight turned much of the country against homosexuals. New laws were passed. Congress put pressure on the District of Columbia police force to make arrests, to cite alleged homosexuals, so that their names could be identified and they could be fired from federal government jobs. As a result, thousands lost their jobs. The DC Police Department created what they called the Pervert Elimination Squad. It was about 600 undercover officers who would go out into the community, to the bars and the restaurants and the parks, to make eye contact with males. They were targeted at males, and arrest them. And that was one of the undercover officers Lester Hunt Jr. encountered that night in June of 1953. Initially, the U.S. attorney and the arresting police officer made the decision that the charges should be dismissed. Young Hunt was a seminarian student, never had any problem with the law, would have been kicked out of his seminary if this charge went forward, and so they said, we'll dismiss the charges. Well, Senators Bridges and Senator Welker, Herman Welker from Idaho, were the two leading Republicans then who learned about this. And so they called in the police officer, made all sorts of threats about him, claimed they had evidence that he had taken a bribe in order to drop the charges. Then they contacted a friend of Lester Hunt's, who was also a friend of Herman Welker's, a guy named Red Jacoby, who's a big name in Wyoming history. He was the athletic director in years when Wyoming won a national basketball championship and was going to major bowl games. And Red Jacoby had grown up with Herman Welker in Idaho, and they were big sports fanatics. And so Welker and Bridges call Jacoby and say, hey, look, you need to warn your good friend Lester Hunt that if he doesn't resign from the Senate immediately, we're going to make sure these charges against his son are reinstated, and we're going to get him convicted, and that'll be a problem for him politically. Well, Hunt said, I won't be blackmailed, and so they did get the charges reinstated. And that October, young Hunt went to trial, a week-long trial in the District of Columbia, and he was convicted. Those who knew the Hunts then watched them every day at the trial, and they said you could visibly see them age. Lester Hunt's hair went from brown to gray nearly overnight. He became a recluse. He would not even eat lunch in the Senate cafeteria. It was just almost destroyed he and his wife. And so over the next few months, he considered whether he would run for re-election in 1954. At Christmas time in 1953, while the Hunts were back in Wyoming celebrating Christmas, somebody broke into their Washington, D.C. apartment, ransacked it, took nothing of value, but it was clear that they were looking for something that they thought would be there that would help smear Lester Hunt's name, and there of course was nothing. But if you can imagine the pressure that would put on Senator Hunt and his wife, that having had your privacy invaded like that. And so they talked for several months about whether or not to run again. Polls showed he would win overwhelmingly. And so in April of 1954, he announced for re-election. The senators, Welker and Bridges, continued up the ante. They printed 25,000 posters, told Senator Hunt that if he didn't resign immediately, that they would put one of those in every mailbox in Wyoming. Now, the reason they needed him to resign immediately is that the control of the Senate was one seat to the Democrats, and here you have this Democrat in Republican Wyoming. If they could just get him to resign, the Republican governor in Wyoming would appoint a Republican, and control of the Senate would shift overnight. And so that's why that pressure. At some point during those days, in May of 1954, a White House staffer, a high-ranking White House staffer in the Eisenhower administration, shows up at Lester Hunt's office with an offer the president had approved that said to Hunt, if you will resign immediately and agree to never run for the Senate again, you can run for governor back in Wyoming, but never again for the Senate, President Eisenhower will appoint you to the Federal Trade Commission, which was a 6-year appointment at a salary above what senators were paid. Hunt wants to do it. He's tired of all of the pressure. He wants to get that behind him. But his wife and his friends say, how could you do that? How do you explain that to your friends back home, that you have this big, important job and the control of the Senate is shifted to the Republican Party? And so he decided that he would not do that, sent word to the president that he was not interested. And then on the day before Lester Hunt kills himself, the reason happens. People who understand suicide say that those who think about it go through kind of a roller coaster, up and down. One day they feel like they want to take their life, the next day maybe not. But for those who ultimately do take their life, there's something that happens in the hours preceding the suicide that is the final straw. And for Lester Hunt, that was a Joe McCarthy press conference on Friday afternoon, when McCarthy announces publicly that he intends to open a Senate hearing to investigate a Democratic member of the Senate who was involved in taking a bribe. That's the big piece of evidence that connects Joe McCarthy to the conspiracy, because the only people who had ever talked about a bribe were Senators Bridges and Welker back in the fall of 1953, when in a private meeting with the police officer, when they said, we have evidence that you took a bribe. Now, in my sense of these things is that when that happened, when McCarthy made that announcement, though he felt he was innocent, he understood as well as anybody what it would mean to be dragged through a Joe McCarthy hearing, and how much of your name would be smeared and your reputation ruined. He was already distraught because he knew that last October and September, if he had just resigned from the Senate then, his son could have been spared all of this. his wife could have been spared all of it, and their life could have started over. So now we're in June of 1954. His son has been convicted. Have been all these threats about the blackmail, and now he is looking ahead to a future where he's going to be a target of a McCarthy hearing. He's already announced he would not run for re-election. He had pulled out of the race. But that wasn't enough for these people. They needed to get him out of the Senate now so that the control of the Senate could shift before the fall elections. And so my sense of it, after getting to know Hunt through his letters and his diaries and his speeches, is that that's the moment when he said, there's only one way out of this. And early the next morning, he took it. In my view, that was the end for Joe McCarthy. Just a few days before all of this happened were the Army McCarthy hearings that really started McCarthy's downfall and caused the public to begin to turn on McCarthy. But I think that when one of their own, a very popular colleague in the Senate, committed suicide, others had committed suicide as a result of Joe McCarthy, but when it was one of their own, and a man as popular and well-liked as Hunt, I think that turned the tide solidly against McCarthy, and it was just a few months later that he was censured by the Senate, and the end came for him. I have an old friend, a little younger than me, whose family was very political. His aunt was on Senator Hunt's staff the day that he killed himself, and Bernie Phelan is this fellow's name. Bernie said, you know, I remember a time in our family where every day we talked about Lester Hunt. But he said there came a day where we never talked about him again. And he said, I didn't understand that until now. But the nature of his death and the circumstances surrounding it were such that they almost completely erased this man's accomplishments. So one of the real pleasures about researching and writing this book was to learn about his accomplishments and to write about them, because while his death was sensational and it's certainly a compelling story, as I said, this is an individual who is probably the most important national politician whose name was forgotten at the time of his death.